We're going to get started now. Good afternoon. I hope you all had a good lunch, and we do have a full day today. The morning was very great, and we have two panels this afternoon that I think will be equally great. I'm sure they will be. So without any further ado, I want to kind of just briefly introduce the chair for this panel here, Karen Drake, Professor Karen Drake from Lakehead University, the new law school in Northern Ontario, and she has kindly agreed to come and chair this panel. She does a lot of work on Aboriginal rights at the Faculty of Law there and on Indigenous legal traditions, and it's an honor to have Karen chair this panel this afternoon.
Great, thank you, Larry. It's my honor to introduce our panelists. I'm going to introduce them each as they speak. So to begin with, we have Sebastien Grammond. So Sebastien Grammond has been a professor at the Civil Law section of the University of Ottawa since 2004. He's taught a number of courses, and he became a full professor in 2011. And from 2009 to 2014, he served as dean. Now, among his many accomplishments, I'm only going to list a few here. So his main research interests pertain to Indigenous peoples and the law, and more generally to legal treatment of minority issues. He's authored 3 books and several papers on these topics. He served as a law clerk to Chief Justice Antonio Lemaire of the Supreme Court of Canada, and he previously practiced with Dentons in Montreal. He's appeared before the Quebec Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court of Canada. Please join me in welcoming Sebastien Grammond.
Thank you. So, you hear me? Yeah. So my research... Thank you. So my research focuses, or at least this research project focuses on Section 35 cases post-Pauli that involve individuals or groups asserting Metis identity, or at least non-First Nations identity in support of their claim to Aboriginal or, well, sometimes, but most usually Aboriginal rights, sometimes treaty rights. And today I will focus on a subset of those cases where there appears to be a phenomenon where people are recharacterizing themselves as Métis because they also have another plausible identity, which is Francophone or Acadian. But to do, and then I chose this perhaps provocative title, Choosing Métis Identity. So to get there, I have to I guess talk about something that you already know, but I will do it anyway, as someone did earlier today, how the Pauli judgment relies on a concept called ethnogenesis. And can we think beyond that? Are there good reasons for doing so? And could that cover the kind of cases that I just talked about what you could call identity switching? So, I would say that the Pauli test did not come out of thin air. It was the product of an intellectual environment that views ethnic groups not as sort of pre-existing objective realities that you can observe as if it were under a microscope and then isolate some essential characteristics. No, there has been a move away from essentialism and towards an intellectual posture called constructivism. And the idea is that an ethnic group, like many other concepts that we use, is a constructed concept. It arises in the course of social interaction. It does not, it may or may not rely on distinctive characteristics that would appear obvious to an external observer. It is rather the importance of particular characteristics as markers of distinction or distinctiveness is constructed in the course of history by the groups themselves. And this has the consequence that ethnic groups can arise, can change, and can disappear in the course of social interaction. And that view was made popular by Fredrik Barth, a Norwegian anthropologist, in the late 60s. And that laid the foundation for an analysis of the advent of the Metis nation that saw the Metis nation as one such case of an ethnic group created in the course of social interaction, in this case in the 18th and 19th centuries. And that was that view was expressed in particular in a book that we saw earlier this morning, The New Nation, in 1985. And on that, the Royal Commission could build its discussion of the Metis nation, essentially focusing on the idea that it was not people of mixed origin or mixed racial background, but rather specific communities. Again, relying on the same intellectual foundations. And you saw that in the Court of Appeal judgment in Pauli. So the Supreme Court could then say that, no, we're not talking about people of mixed racial heritage. We are really talking about distinctive peoples. Okay, so mixed ancestry is not enough. You have to have your own customs, way of life, and recognizable group identity separate from Indian or Inuit and European. In other words, you have to be, it's mixed but separate. And then you have this definition that you find in the judgment. So again, distinctive collective identity. And the court says it is, not there, but in other places in its judgment, it is called ethnogenesis. And the subsequent cases also use that concept. And they look for ethnogenesis. And in many cases, they don't find it. And the claim is denied more or less on that basis. Now, I ask a question. Can we go beyond ethnogenesis? In other words, do you need to prove ethnogenesis in order to qualify for Aboriginal rights recognized by Section 35? And perhaps one way of answering that question is to figure out what was the purpose of Section 35 sub 2, the phrase or the sentence. Well, the Aboriginal peoples of Canada include the Inuit, the Indians, Inuit, and Métis. And it seems to me that you can plausibly say that the purpose was to remedy exclusion. That the framers of the Constitution knew full well that the Indian Act was under-inclusive, that there were many indigenous groups or individuals that did not have Indian status under the Indian Act, and they did not want to limit constitutional recognition to those people then recognized as status Indians. Now, if you accept that premise, it leads you to, I would say, complex factual inquiry. It leads you to ask the question, well, how were certain groups or individual is excluded, it puts the light on the various processes of exclusion. And the moment you scratch this a little bit, you realize that there were many such processes in place. Some of them were enshrined in legislation, such as the exclusion of the Métis Nation by a particular provision of the Indian Act. You could not have Indian status if you were Métis. But in many cases, it might have been administrative oversight, decisions made by Indian agents in the field, and so on and so on. And what strikes me is that very little research has been done on those other processes of exclusion. And this is why when we're talking about when we're trying to think about the situation of other indigenous groups, we lack the sort of compass that we have, for example, when we're thinking about the Métis Nation, because it has been the object of many studies. And you also realize that in many cases that exclusion may have taken place post-contact through actions of the government that were designed or that had the effect of severing some people from their communities and thereby more or less creating new communities. And if you accept Barth's views that new ethnic groups may arise throughout history, then you might ask the question, well, did a new indigenous group arise? And you can think of urban indigenous groups. Often they are the product of many forms of exclusion, and some of those people who were excluded went to the city and eventually coalesced into new groups. Now, that was one example of how people could react to exclusion, but there were many others. And it's, for example, I mentioned assimilation. Some people might have said, okay, I will stop saying that I'm an Indian. Hiding, such as is alleged, some of the people that I will mention later, or joining other groups, as was said earlier this morning. And then you ask the question, well, what are the normative consequences of these choices made by individuals in situations of exclusion in the past? What are the consequences today? And then it raises the question, well, were those choices entirely free and informed? I don't know. And then, if they were, can you reverse them today by saying, okay, I reassert an indigenous identity? So these are tough questions. And I want just to give, perhaps I'll go quickly, but there are examples. For example, about the Algonquins of Ontario, Bonita Lawrence in her recent book says that, well, it's during the reserve creation process in the early 20th century that many Algonquin persons refused to go on the reserve and stayed wherever they were and tried to continue living as they were previously. But eventually that was made difficult by the oncoming settlers. And today, these people have taken a political route. It's not a judicial route. And they are, at least to the present day, successful in negotiating a treaty that will recognize them as indigenous. Now, let me draw your attention to cases in another part of the country, in New Brunswick. And I could talk about the Hopper case that went up to the Court of Appeal, but I will highlight Vautour. So Vautour, you see him here, is a man who led the contestation of the expropriations that paved the way for the creation of the Kuchibouguac National Park in eastern New Brunswick in the 1970s. It was a small community that were described as Acadians. They were living on the seaside, so they were fishers, and they had to move. They were expropriated. The houses were either removed or demolished. And Vautour was, well, he spearheaded the contestation. He refused to move, and to this day he is still living in the Couchibouguac National Park, supposedly illegally. Now, in the early 2000s, he adopted he has always been viewed as Acadian, and Zachary Richard, the famous singer, even wrote a song in his honor, La Ballade de Jackie Vautour. But in the early 2000s, he's contesting a fishing charge on the basis that he has Aboriginal rights as a Métis. And he asserts Métis identity. He has created an association of Métis people in southeastern New Brunswick, of which I understand he's the chief. So what are we to make of that, of such assertions? So his arguments and his evidence made essentially these propositions. First of all, he had mixed Acadian and Mi'kmaq ancestry. He engaged in subsistence activities typical of Mi'kmaq culture. And his lawyer and his expert, who was Stephen Augustine, who works at the Canadian Museum of Civilization here, they made the argument that, well, there was indeed a community, but it was a shadow community. The problem was that there was no such mention of a shadow community in any historical document anywhere. And the witnesses for the prosecution had an easy job demolishing this argument on the basis that it was not supported by any document. And so the judgment reached the conclusion that there was no ethnogenesis. There was no separate community ever arose. You had people of mixed ancestry, that's for sure, but they went either with the Mi'kmaq or with the Acadians. The court noted also that the identification as Mi'kmaq or as Métis, was recent, and so it, raised the specter of opportunism. And it also said that hunting and fishing were not culturally distinctive in the sense that Acadians and Mi'kmaq both engage in such activities, but it could not be used to distinguish Mi'kmaqs from Acadians or to distinguish a third ethnic group. And most importantly, but perhaps in a muted fashion in judgment, the court says, well, all Acadians can find some Mi'kmaq ancestry if they look up their genealogical tree. And this cannot be enough to qualify as Aboriginal or Métis. So what should we think of this? And here I'm just stepping outside the social science paradigm of observation, and I'm becoming a lawyer again, and I'm saying, is this right or wrong? And my thinking starts with the idea that we cannot have an abstract definition or an objective definition of the term indigenous or Aboriginal. at the United Nations, they were not able to reach agreement on a definition, and we have a declaration that contains no such definition. Perhaps the reason is that indigenous is a relative concept. It's not only based on ancestry, it's not only based on cultural traits, but on a particular history of relationships between two groups. So you cannot. So before the Europeans arrived in North America, there were no indigenous peoples. There were Hurons, there were Mi'kmaq, Haudenosaunee, and so on. But they did not feel the need to define themselves as indigenous. It is a process, a product of a historical process, and not any historical process, the process of colonization. Okay? In other words, it is the concept of indigenous or aboriginal is a reflection of a particular kind of injustice, one based on the idea that people of European origin were superior. Of course, this is a racist idea. And on the basis of all the policies that were enacted or put in place as a result of such a vision. Now, there are many other injustices in our society. And for example, you might think about the treatment of rural people by people in cities who hold essentially the power, or injustices linked to the animosity between Francophones and Anglophones. In other words, between groups of European origin. And I would think that these do not count as, do not produce indigenous groups, because they're outside the paradigm of colonization based on the belief of inferiority, which is probably the hallmark of the concept of indigenous people. So then I would reach the result that the courts in this case were correct in saying that, well, Acadians cannot recharacterize themselves as indigenous. They may have suffered from injustice, especially in this particular case, but this is not the kind of injustice that the rights given to the Aboriginal people seek to remedy. Now, in saying that, I'm not, first of all, obviously I'm not saying that if you speak French you cannot be indigenous. That's obviously not true. And I'm not excluding the possibility that groups that there might be a residual category of indigenous peoples, not the Métis Nation, not First Nations, not Inuit, but still being able to claim Aboriginal rights. It is difficult to delineate what are the bounds of such category, because I think of the multiplicity of their circumstances and the variety of the processes of exclusion that gave rise to such groups. It may be that some frontier families, as Paul mentioned yesterday, were indeed indigenous families, and perhaps that they coalesced into groups that can have Aboriginal rights. The fact is that it's difficult, even 10 years and more, 12 years after Pauli, to say so. And that tells you a lot about, first, the state of the research about those phenomena of exclusion, and the weight of the burden of proof that the courts require, and the difficulty for people in a marginalized situation to assemble something that comes even close to or anything close to meeting such a burden of proof. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Grammond. It's now my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Chris Andersen. So Professor Andersen is a professor in the Faculty of Native Studies at the University of Alberta and is currently the director of the Rupertsland Centre for Métis Research. He's the author of 2 books, the most recent of which is entitled Métis, Race, Recognition, and the Struggle for Indigenous Peoplehood. It was recently awarded the Best Subsequent Book Award by the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association this year. He's the author of a number of other articles as well, and he's the founding member of the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association Executive Council. He was also recently named to the Royal Society of Canada's College of New Scholars, Artists, and Scientists. So please join me in welcoming Chris Andersen.
Thank you, everybody. I'm going to read fairly closely from a prepared text because I'm sort of not quite sure about the ideas yet, so I want to make sure I already say dumb stuff that I've written. I want to make sure I don't say too many dumb things that I haven't written. I want to begin, though, by acknowledging our presence on the unceded territory of the Algonquin people, by thanking the Métis Treaty Collective for their kind invitation and for Professor Chartrand's intriguing talk last night to inaugurate the conference. Some of you might know that Paul wrote the introduction to a recent book that just came out, so this talk may sound eerily familiar, though it'll be delivered with far less gravitas than Paul's talk was yesterday. And I want to say, too, as I said before, that I'm working some things out in this presentation. I don't mean that like from a Freudian standpoint. I mean like logically I'm working some things out. So these should be understood as kind of ideas that I'm not fully settled on yet, rather than kind of a polished piece. So within the broad fields of Canadian law, while the various fields of Canadian law have delved into issues relating to collectivity broadly conceived, little of this discussion has extended to an analysis of nationhood or peoplehood, Indigenous or otherwise. And while scholars like Kathy Bell and Paul Chartrand have talked about Métis in terms of peoplehood in the past, these have been the exception rather than the rule. An unfortunate side effect of this lack of discussion has been a tendency to use nationhood and peoplehood interchangeably. And I'll argue today that despite this tendency, important insights can be gained by treating them as analytically separate. Though non-juridical, one strain of theorizing in particular that has resisted the pull of their conflation has been Holmes et al.'s notion of the peoplehood matrix, which positions it in direct contrast to the idea of nationhood, which the authors suggest is too encumbered with the freight of the logics and tendencies of state building to be useful to understanding Indigenous histories. I'm just going to grab my water here.
Yeah.
That's fine. Thanks. So my talk today is organized around the idea that its dismissal of nationhood notwithstanding, Holmes et al. Peoplehood model remains useful to help us think juridically about Métis history. However, in contrast to this model, I'm going to argue that nationhood doesn't exist in contrast to peoplehood, but rather the two are opposite sides of the same coin. Nationhood is how we understand ourselves internally, while peoplehood is how we may understand ourselves externally in relationship with other peoples, Indigenous or otherwise. As such, these two concepts gain their fullest explanatory potential when used in tandem, and they possess great potential as a core analytic framework for understanding Indigenous histories and understanding Métis history in particular. The stakes of this methodological discussion could not be higher. We live in a country and an era in which so-called Métis communities are coming out of the woodwork, making post-colonizing claims to indigeneity based on their mixedness and that of their ancestors, and the ability of their ancestors to, quote, hide in plain sight for 2 centuries and more. Creating new organizations, these folks have gathered together and presented scattered references to Métis in various French-language colonial archives as evidence of not only historical continuity, but historical Métis continuity. Much of this activity is not only tacitly accepted, but actively endorsed by many who have felt free to level charges of exclusion and even racism at those of us who ask that, at the very least, we take so-called recovery efforts with a grain of salt. A focus on pre-colonial nationhood and peoplehood brings to bear an analytical clarity and an empirical complexity on colonial Canada's will to recognize such deeply racialized claims by asking us to think through the historical diplomatic relationships not only between the Métis and the nascent Canadian state, but between Métis and other Indigenous peoples. And in that context, let me begin with a very brief discussion of the peoplehood matrix, and I'll follow it up with what I regard as a more interesting element around nationhood and the relationship between nationhood and peoplehood. So the peoplehood matrix, It's a model that draws on the insights of Cherokee scholar Robert Thomas's work around group identity. Holmes et al. Suggests that, quote, it reflects an accurate picture of the ways in which Native Americans act, react, pass along knowledge, and connect with the ordinary as well as the supernatural worlds. Situated in these larger aspirations, the authors emphasize 4 equal and interacting elements: language, sacred history, place territory, and ceremonial cycles. The value of the peoplehood matrix, they argue, stems in part from its ability to account for and reflect Indigenous knowledge and philosophies, in particular, our relationality, quote, between human beings, animals, plants, societies, the cosmos, the spirit world, and the function of other natural or even catastrophic occurrences, unquote. Indigenous peoplehood, they explain, allows us to sustain such a relationship in the face of colonial attempts to erase them. As useful as their model is, however, a somewhat puzzling element of their argument is their dismissal of Indigenous nationhood. The explicit juxtaposition of these two concepts is equally strange insofar as nationhood has come increasingly to stand for example, a core analytical concept in the last 2 decades of Indigenous studies scholarship. I want to turn now in more detail to their critique of nationhood by paying particular attention to a contradiction which stands at the heart of their argument. Exploring this contradiction will afford us an opportunity not only to demonstrate the utility of the nation model, long made extensive use of by Indigenous scholars in their critique of settler colonialism, but to demonstrate its potential when paired with the retooled conception of peoplehood. So, Indigenous nationhood, what do I mean when I say it's the way that we imagine ourselves internally? And this is partly prescriptive. I'm not just saying it is the way, I'm saying it's the way we should be imagining ourselves internally. Holmes et al.'s critique of nationhood, though brief, hinges on 2 basic elements that are shared by many other dismissals of nationhood in relation to historical indigeneity. Its hierarchical and thus teleological assumptions, and its supposed lack of permanency. Regarding the first, the authors argue that the nation's relationship to Western hierarchies, in particular statehood, make it difficult to conceive outside of the constitutively powerful influence of these organizational forms, hence the seeming natural couplet between nation and state, which we know as nation-states. This is not an unreasonable assumption. Indeed, much of the core Western literature on the nation form explores its relationship with the growth of modern states. Additionally, Holmes et al. Raise a second objection, namely that the nation lacks the durability of peoplehood. To wit, quote, nations which are primarily viewed as the territorial limits of states that encompass a number of communities do not necessarily constitute a people, nor do they have the permanency of peoplehood, unquote. Which Holmes et al. Immediately follow by explaining that, quote, nations may come and go, but peoples maintain identity even when the nations may come and go, but peoples maintain identity even when the undergoing profound cultural change occurs, unquote. Let me shore up their discussion of nationhood to explain what's wrong with it and how it can be rescued. Usually discussions on nationhood tend to understand nations as things. Usually discussions of nationhood tend to understand nations not as things, but rather as processes. In the context of this processual dynamic, nationness is, in Benedict Andersen's memorable phrase, quote, imagined as a community because regardless of the actual inequality and exploitation that may prevail in each, the nation is always conceived as a deeply horizontal comradeship, unquote. In this context, and despite the easy familiarity, I want to suggest first that there's no necessary link between nationhood and modernity, which is usually conceptualized as the state. And second, that the unwillingness of the courts to talk about Métis history in terms of our nationhood and peoplehood both relies on and reproduces Canada's claims to legitimacy as a liberal nation state. Now, regarding the relationship between nationhood and modernity, various scholars have challenged the idea that historical Indigenous collectivities should be thought of as nations. Mired in the nation-state dyad, these authors have dismissed its analytical relevance and corporeal presence. And as I explored in my book, Métis, it's a very clever name, I know. When you guys write a book and you end up with a month-long fight with the publisher of the book, and then that's the title that all of you least disagree with, then you can start to see why maybe it kind of starts to niggle at you when you keep looking at it. Where was I? I digress. As I explored in my book Métis, scholars of pre-state Great Lakes and Plains Indigenous society in particular identify nationhood in terms of clear geographical boundaries and categorical identities, which they then suggest fails to account for the contextual kinds of relations that existed in these geographies and in these eras. Michael Witkin, for example, argues that far from being a world of nation, what he calls the native New World was comprised of bands, clans, villages, and peoples, tied together by webs of kinship. He instead understands and analyzes these geographies and eras through a lens of peoplehood, repeating, in my view, the same mistake common in Indigenous discussions on these issues more broadly. Similarly, Saint-Onge and Pedrogny argue that nationhood, with its notion of abstracted identities, central authority, and clear territorial boundaries, de-emphasizes the mobility that lay at the heart of 19th century Métis ontologies. Offering instead a webbed notion of kinship that tied people together across time and space, this research either dismisses nationhood altogether or discusses it only long enough to then dismiss it. However, again, as I argued in my book Métis, once you guys write a book, the other thing is you're basically hooped for the next kind of 1.5 years. So I tend to draw on a lot of the stuff that I spent 10 years writing, but there is some new stuff in here just to kind of make that clear. However, as I argued in my book Métis, there's nothing about the presence of nationness that precludes the presence of kinship, and vice versa, despite Ernst Gellner's famous admonition that nationhood represents a turn away from kinship. The question in this context is how to think empirically about the relationship between nationhood and kinship. How does nationness become braided with previously existing sets of collective imaginings, cross-cut by the realities of the geographical and the social relations from which they emerge? Now, I heard someone talking yesterday about the fact, at Rob's talk, why should we even use the idea of nation given that it's a Western colonial concept? Well, I would turn the question back and say, why should we say that its entire meaning is finished or exhausted by the fact that it's used as a Western colonial construct, right? So if we think about the relationship between nationness and modernity, of course that makes sense in a European context where they're obsessed with status. But that doesn't mean that those forms of horizontal comradeship don't also exist in what the people in Europe were calling the New World, which of course wasn't new to the people who actually lived there. Perhaps another way to think about this is to understand that the interconnected components of the peoplehood matrix that are central to Indigenous peoplehood, language, history, ceremony, and territory, could just as easily be analyzed as elements of Indigenous nationhood. And indeed, one might reasonably argue that they work better as markers of nationhood than they do of peoplehood. Does this mean then that nations and people are interchangeable, that peoplehood is simply old wine in a new bottle? The answer to this question is neither simple nor straightforward. Like most things, much depends on context. One way to think about these issues, however, is to ask an additional and at first glance parenthetical question. If we believe in the analytical utility of the peoplehood matrix, when or what eras do we look to in discovering principles from which our contemporary imaginings of peoplehood and nationhood can be derived? So if we believe in the value of history as a basis for making sense on who we are today, where are we looking in the past to understand the origins of our peoplehood? As it turns out, exploring the question about the historical power of Indigenous peoplehood also reveals its distinctiveness from, but relation to, nationhood. And in the interest of improving our understanding of both concepts, I want to explore this now in the third and final part of the paper. So part of the attractiveness of Holmes et al.'s Indigenous Peoplehood Matrix, which has enjoyed widespread legitimacy in Indigenous studies as a discipline, part of the attractiveness is that in contrast to much of the historiographical labor on Indigenous collectivities, the authors spend little time justifying their use of the term. Indeed, for all of their complex discussion of the factors that comprise their model, the authors spend oddly little time exploring why these factors collectively comprise an Indigenous peoplehood in particular, as opposed to any number of other markers of collective consciousness, nationhood included. This lack of precision also goes some of the way to understanding why the principal elements of their matrix might seem so familiar to students of Indigenous nationhood. Indeed, they argue that peoplehood possesses its own inherent sovereignty, predating and thus serving as a basis for nationalism. And more importantly for our discussion here, the authors suggest that peoplehood, quote, serves to explain and define codes of conduct, civility, behavior within a given environment, and relationships between people, unquote. We may draw from their conceptual cartography two analytical traces that are helpful to a repositioning of peoplehood. First is their insistence that it existed prior to colonialism, cultural modification, or profound cultural change. And the second is that peoplehood is observable in its ability to regulate relationships between people. They likely meant this latter element in terms of the governing of individual members of a single people, but it can also be thought of in a broader sense to emphasize a central tenet of peoplehood, its ability to enter into formal relationships other than by force with similarly minded peoples. Peoplehood is thus distinctive from all other categories of collectivity for its ability to produce and have what legal scholar Jeremy Weber has, Peoplehood is thus distinctive from all other categories of collectivity for its ability to produce and have respected what legal scholar Jeremy Weber has termed intersocietal norms, or customs which, quote, enabled the parties to establish stable expectations regarding each other's conduct and provided grounding for criticizing that conduct when it departed from the norms. So people had a way to interact with each other that didn't require shooting each other, stabbing each other, or any number of different things that people do to each other when they don't agree on things. And I'm just speaking about my home community. That's a joke. That's a joke. I'm sure our rates of violence are the same. Anyway. In a sense, a people is a normative order in all the aspects detailed by Holmes et al. In that, like communities, kinship groups, or even families, it produces internal norms. But more importantly, a people also possesses the ability to compel a competing people or peoples to co-produce intersocietal norms that reflect neither people's internal norms, but reflect their formal relationality. In the specific context of Métis history, then, peoplehood becomes an important lens for understanding what tenets of history we would explore to figure out what made the Métis a people and how it differentiates us from more recent and, in my mind, more dubious claims to Métis identity that contain little of the relationality or intersocietal norm building of something like, for example, the Manitoba Act of 1870 or oral treaties with the Dakota in the 1850s. Peoplehood becomes crucial, in other words, to looking for what Chartrand and Giacchus have referred to as the positive core of Métis collectivity. Thus, Chartrand and Giacchus argue a peoplehood-based discussion must begin with by identifying collectives with a history of formal crowned Indigenous relations, and I would add to that of formal Indigenous relations as well. In this way, peoplehood is thus the external manifestation of our nationhood, not its replacement. Hence, and here I disagree with Holmes et al., while a people rarely exists without a nation, nations, or at least nationalism, can certainly exist without an accompanying peoplehood. More specific to a colonial context, they can also exist in the face of diminished settler recognition of it. Among the most deliberate projects of colonial powers includes their concerted efforts to diminish our Indigenous peoplehood by dismantling and attempting to dismiss the intersocietal norms that governed previous interactions between us. Does this mean, then, contrary to Holmes et al. Claims, that contemporary Indigenous collectivities, nations or otherwise, are not also peoples? It does not, but it does mean that the strength of our peoplehood, at least vis-a-vis settler nation states, has undeniably been diminished. And I don't think there's any form of logic or any capacity for analysis that comes from not admitting and thinking about what the consequences of that are. However, let me quickly register two caveats to this observation, which in the interest of space I'll only sketch here. First, whether or not our contemporary peoplehood matches its historical power, we may nonetheless draw on the cognate historical eras to form normative principles for our contemporary nationhood and peoplehood discussions. Right? We can look to the past to think about how we want to deal with issues today and look to the future. Not because our pre-colonial identities are more authentic than today's, but because we were at the height of our power in controlling our own destinies in a manner which is not the case today. Second, contemporary settler nation states' failure to act honorably, according to the intersocietal norms embedded in historical eras of formal diplomacy, whether through treaties or other instruments, does not mean that, as Indigenous peoples, we should not continue to act in a manner that honors them, in our interactions with one another and in our interactions with the state. Indeed, while settler nation states continually fail to recognize and meaningfully act on their responsibilities to Indigenous peoples, we have continued to show respect for intersocietal norms, and a growing literature has shown the manner in which Indigenous peoples have continued to relate to colonial powers as peoples, even following the impact of colonialism into the 21st century. These points become all the more important when we think again about the tendency of individuals to make claims to indigeneity, particularly Métis indigeneity, absent attachment to a community linked to the Métis people. These newfound claims range from people in the Gaspé Peninsula making DNA or genetic-based claims to a Métis presence for more than 2,000 years. So think about that. They're saying that there have been Métis there for 2,000 years. I'm not a mathematician here, but maybe there is somebody in here that is a mathematician. That just doesn't add up. Or the newly formed Métis Federation of Canada, making treaties willy-nilly with other various newly formed, quote, Métis organizations. These kind of claims are only possible in a colonial nation-state like Canada that fails to respect the peoplehood of Indigenous polities. If we take seriously the principles governing our historical peoplehood at the zenith of its power, they can and should continue to serve as an appropriate touchstone for working through debates about our contemporary collective Indigenous, our Métis selves, rather than simply reaching into the past and borrowing whatever historical resources are deemed most expedient, or simply making claims to self-identification as they seem to fit or as the will to possess strikes us. I can think of no other context within which someone could claim to be Indigenous where they would not be asked who their family or community was. Indeed, in the premise of the argument that undergirds this paper, it's based on a deceptively simple maxim. Who I or you or anyone claims to be is far less important than who claims you. Self-identifying claims in the absence of connection to a living community with pre-colonial roots amounts to little more than white possessiveness, what we might, in less charitable moments, refer to as ethnic fraud. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Andersen. I am now delighted to introduce our final panelist, Denis Gagnon. Professor Gagnon is a full professor at the Department of Anthropology at the Université de Saint-Boniface and an associate professor at Université de Laval. He's the principal researcher on a major SSHRC project, and from 2004 to 2014, he held the Canada Research Chair in Métis Identity. His main research areas are Canadian International Métis Studies, Identity, Indigenous Religions, Ontology, and Power Relations. His many accomplishments are extensive, and I won't read them all now. However, I do commend to you his biography. I will only sum up the following. His research work on Métis identity has allowed him to hire over 60 students, many of whom are postdoctoral trainees, to write 11 chapters and 12 academic articles, to organize a seminar and workshop subsidized by SSHRC, and to hold over 30 conferences across Canada, France, Mexico, and Japan. Please join me in welcoming Denis Gagnon.
Bonjour. Je tiens tout d'abord à remercier Larry Chartrand pour m'avoir invité à ce colloque, offrant ici une tribune où une voix dissidente peut s'exprimer à ses risques et périls. C'est un honneur pour moi et un privilège d'être ici, Larry. Merci. For the people who don't understand French or Michif, don't worry, I have already switched in the second official language of Canada. Today, this talk will outline how the Canadian government and the Métis National Council perceive the other Métis and how these other Métis perceive themselves through the report work of the Standing Senate Committee on Aboriginal People on Métis Identity. As a scientist and not an activist, I will also try to initiate at long term a calm and comforting discussion of the peril of objectification of subjective identities. Here are the positions of the Métis in implicit Canadian social category. You see that there is one group apart, the other Métis. This is with this community and people that I work since more than 10 years. Unlike the Indian, who are trapped in a cycle of dependency by the fur trade company since the 17th century, the Métis remain free and they spread throughout North America. By the 19th century, there was a sort of Métis empire, strange empires, as said Howard, in the Midwest of the continent. Specializing in the buffalo hunt, the fur trade, and the pemmican trade. After the extermination of the buffalo, some Métis will be lumped together with their relative First Nation or French Canadian. Some others remain Métis. And in the Midwest of the United States, along the Mississippi, Illinois, Arkansas, they were referred to as French Indian and soon being forgotten. In Canada, after two lost resistance in the prairies and a long oblivion from government, Métis became an indigenous people in 1982. Although, unlike First Nation and the Inuit, they did not have the advantage of clear definition for legal purpose, which opened the door to a juridical circus unique in the world. Set up in 1990s, the Standing Senate Committee on Aboriginal People is mandated to examine issues pertaining to First Nation, Inuit and Métis. And in March of 2012, as an initiative of Métis Senator Jerry Saint-Germain, the Standing Senate Committee on Aboriginal People to examine and report on the evolving legal and political recognition of the collective identity and right of the Métis in Canada, was set up. When are you going? In Winnipeg, in Ottawa? No, at the committee. And public hearing took place in Western Canada and in Ottawa. From March to December 2012, on behalf of 26 organizations or as individual, 76 people, including me, presented an evidence. In June 2012, the committee report, The People Who Own Themselves, Recognition of Metis Identity in Canada, was tabled. This report, which is intended to be a summary of the evidence, contained in an appendix a portrait of the community from 7 regions, which, one suspect, represent for the committee the real Métis in Canada. Conspicuously absent are Labrador, Quebec, the Maritime Province, and Ontario. They speak the fact that the Sault Ste. Marie Métis community has received official recognition on poly judgment. The purpose of the report is not to define who is the Métis, because this definition is up to them, but it is to initiating a constructive public discussion on the identity of the Métis and their recognition by the federal government for legal and policy purpose. I love this word, policy purpose. Clearly, the Métis issues seem to return to the political stage after decades spent in legal battles. The introduction to the report purport to be open to the diversity of Métis community across Canada, but it does not dare state clearly that these communities are the ones that have already been recognized. The title is a case in point. The People Who Own Themselves translate the Cree word Otipemisiwak, which was used in the past to designate the Red River Métis. If the committee includes the Northwest Territory Métis and those from part of British Columbia, it's only because they don't have choice to recognize them as Métis, as they were the focus of Treaty Number 8 in 1899 and Treaty Number 11 in 1921. Never published, but available online, in the two official languages, the 6,000 pages of transcript of evidence are very rich and give also to the sensitive reader an idea of the premise and postulate that underlie the report. What has been chosen, what has been omitted, and why. We began with the testimony on other Métis. First, by Aboriginal Affairs and Department of Justice. Second, by an account of Métis National Council speaker. And third, with the claim from not recognized Métis Association. Government position. To begin with, a senator asked an Aboriginal affair. Another one? No. Okay. To begin with, a senator asked an Aboriginal Affairs representative how recognition to the Eastern Métis is going, and which communities have stood up to the Pauli test. The department replies that the number of these organizations has been reduced because several have not followed any process of identification among their members. Therefore, the department found only the MNC and its subsidiaries, and is concerned only with the harvesting right and identification registries of its members. It has spent $35 million to set up registries since 2004 and said that 4 registries will be complete in 2017. And it carried out an evaluation in 2008 in order to establish an ISO standard for Metis through the Canadian Standard Association. The department has established 3 distinct categories of Metis identity: the legal definition, the cultural definition, and identity as function of programs. However, they say that the issue is extremely complex and it gets more confusing the more look into it. The Senate then asked the Department of Justice if the 20 historical profile of mixed European Indian ancestry community, or the OG report, were done before 2004 and 2013 at the cost of $24 million have been made public. In one of its rare interventions, 3 in all, they admit that they don't know. The other questions are about the repercussion of the Daniels affair, and the department point out that the federal government considered the Metis not to be covered by Section 91 of the 1867 Constitution, adding that whatever the Supreme Court decision, the government won't have to change its position. It's quite surprising, given the enormous power this department has over the identity and the status of Metis, to see how few questions are asked about this. The committee could have called into question the hegemony of the legal approach and the absolute power of judges in decisions that are more political than juridical in nature. To sum up, government evidence is characterized by a degree of confusion, an obvious lack of knowledge of the issues, and a paradoxical approach to the decision of the court. Paul's judgment is raised to the rank of dogma, while Daniel is rejected. While this testimony are the epitome of caution, that of the Métis National Council is disturbingly radical. The position on other Métis of MNC, which think it represents the only Métis in the know and unknown universe, is well represented by the labor and activist Jean Théier. Théier represents the Red River Métis in the most radical and exclusive way possible. In this view, the Métis are an Aboriginal people originating magically from the Red River colony, and they have no connection with Métis from Eastern Canada, the Northwest Territory, or British Columbia. Her testimony, which can be best described as impassionate, if not virulent, was so agitated that several times the senators envied her to catch her breath, what I've done right now. Here is her story. The Métis are historically the people of real, and in English, the usual expression was mixed blood. But as the term was pejorative, people decided to use the name Métis for all those who had some native blood. After that, everything got confused, said Théier. And Métis became the generic term, applied not only to real people, but to anyone who had some obscure native great-grandmother from Nova Scotia or elsewhere. We see that her argument has no historical basis and a lot of bias. And she seemed to have forgotten that real peoples were Catholic, Francophone, semi-nomadic farmer, businessman, professional, teacher, and entrepreneur, and count themselves Métis, and that the term mixed blood was only used by Anglophone to describe all population of mixed ancestry. She mentioned that there is also confusion today due to the fact that some Haitian taxi driver of Montreal check off Métis on the census and compromise all the data. In this way, she set the Métis of Nova Scotia and the Haitian of Montreal on an equal footing. Attributing unwarranted importance to herself, she denounced the monster she said she had created at the time of Poley. This monster, which is certainly not human, consists of the other Métis who are standing up for their identity and dignity. What they does not know is that the word Métis was a generic term a long time ago and already in use by Champlain in the 17th century. Too often, English-speaking researchers are monolingual, which prevent them from accessing archival sources in French. One evidence from MNC genealogists even claimed that the word Métis was used for the first time in Canada by Cuthbert Grant, who had translated the Spanish word mestizo in the early 19th century. Despite what Teles claim, it's more probable that the problem began when the half-breed and the mixed blood adopt the name Métis and make a generic term into an appellation contrôlée, or designation of origin, without ever knowing that this term have a long history in New France and North America since a long time. Now we go with the evidence from communities that are not recognized as Métis. 14 not recognized Métis associations with anywhere from 200 to 10,000 members were invited to testify. And I have no idea how these associations were selected by the committee out of the large number of communities that have asserted their identity in court and on the DOJ. In this section, I will give a brief presentation of this community by province and outline their claims. Before I begin, just to give an idea of the discrepancy between the number of organizations that have been heard from and the number of Métis in Canada. Here are the most recent census data. The two organizations from New Brunswick were the New Brunswick Aboriginal People Council and the Canadian Métis Council. The problem is that they self-identify as non-statute Indian who use the term Métis because it was the only way that offers them a strategy for recognition of their traditional harvesting right. Strike one. Ontario was represented by two associations. First, the historic Saugeen Métis, who represent Métis of Sault Ste. Marie, who split from the MNO because they want to deal directly with the government over the question of nuclear plant on their territory. Second, the Red Sky Métis consists of descendants of the 84 half-breed who were recognized by the Crown as beneficiaries and annuitants under the Robinson Superior Treaty of 1850. And they trace their Métis ancestry back to Acadia. All their applications for the government have been rejected, and they now claim access to federal program for Indian. As for Nova Scotia, the organization can do the most harm to the claim of other Métis is without a doubt the Southwest Nova Scotia Métis Council. They have adopted the name Métis, although they know they are Massachusetts Indian, because it is the only way Canada offers them for claim their Aboriginal status. Strike two. The Kepushquik Métis Council of Yarmouth demand recognition of their right despite the Marshall decision, which had confirmed the absence of any historical Métis community. And the Eastern Woodland Métis Nation of Nova Scotia signed an inter-provincial treaty with the Métis of Port McNicoll, Ontario, and want to be recognized as Métis without coming under the control of any association. From Quebec now, members of the Quebec Métis Nation are aligned with the Western Métis, who reject them, but with whom they share a position on the exclusivity of the MNC with respect to the other Métis. To them, in Western Canada, if Western Canada is the Métis homeland, Quebec is the motherland, and they are the only real Métis in Quebec. The second organization, out of the 5 potential Quebec communities that could have been invited, was the Metis Nation of Canada. They do not claim any Aboriginal right and abide by current hunting and fishing law, so as to protect the resource. Their goal, both noble but impossible, is to unite all Canadian Métis people in order to work together. British Columbia now were represented by British Columbia Métis Federation, which bring together 14 communities, and they want to be recognized independently of the MNC. The Kelly Lake Métis Settlement Community is a special case. They have always been ignored by the BC government, and it is Alberta that gave them access to electricity, road, telephone, give their mail, driver license, and insurance. They want to be recognized as Métis by the province of BC. The third organization is the Vancouver Métis Community Association, which issues membership cards to those who request them. As part of a project set up in provincial prison where Aboriginal people may have trouble reconstituting their family tree. Their goal is to raise their profile, strike 3. Lastly, the Northwest Territory were represented by the North Slave Métis Alliance from Yellowknife and Old Fortree, a not recognized branch of the official organization Northwest Territory Métis Nation. At first, they refused to take part in federal negotiation with the Denis and the Métis, and then they were unsuccessful later when they tried to join in. This is the group that made the best recommendation to the Senate Committee. They assert right for all the Métis in Canada. The anthropologist and philosopher Gregory Bateson has once said that the name is not the thing name. On one side, unaware of this premise, the Red River Métis, believing themselves to be the personal focus of Section 35 of the Constitution Act, adopt the generic term as their name. In sum, the Métis are not the real peoples, but the real peoples are Métis, an Aboriginal group or nation, as they said, like all another Aboriginal group, people, community, or nation in Canada. If they have chosen the name Bois Brûlé, Burn Stick, Otypemisiwak, or even Red River Métis, the whole Métis issue in Canada will be much easier to solve. Actually, the Red River Métis proclaim that they have the truth, and all we have to do is to submit and surrender to their ideology and their vision of what is a Métis, and this without any dissidence. That's what we can call maybe totalitarianism. The time wasted in defending a generic term and prohibiting its use by any other Métis community reflect a doctrinaire and ethnocentric nationalism that is as dangerous as it is silly. On the other side, and I know that's the only strategy they have at hand, organizations that use the term Métis to claim Aboriginal right fully conscious that they are not Métis, the strike 1, 2, and 3 we see before, and individuals who define themselves as Métis before the court in order to benefit from hunting and fishing right are doing enormous harm to not yet recognized Métis communities. This group and individual then serve the purpose of the MNC, giving it plenty of ammunition with which to discredit other Métis by putting them all in the same basket, maybe along with the Haitian taxi drivers of Montreal and the descendant of some obscure Indian grandmother of Nova Scotia. Some question maybe for the discussion. Paulites, registry. Did the committee overlook other possible solutions? On this question, thank you. Merci.
Great. Thank you, Professor Gagnon. Well, those were 3 fascinating and provocative presentations, and I think that our speakers probably have a lot to ask each other, but we also have time to hear from the audience. So let's see if we have any questions from the audience before I turn our speakers against each other. Yeah, we have someone at the microphone here. Please go ahead.
Thank you for all your presentations, and it's a lot of ideas that we can shake up in our heads and think about. And also, obviously, Section 35 and the word Métis is at the heart of many discussions, not only this session, but it's an overall theme in this conference. And we've been looking at it mostly, especially in terms of law or legal interpretation, post-1982 or post-enactment of Section 35. And I was wondering if you have insights as to what were the deciders, what was in the mind of the deciders, the drafters of Section 35 when they included the word Métis? What did they have in mind? I know constitutional interpretation does not give a lot of weight to, the drafters of constitutional document, but it's still something that could be relevant in terms of knowledge. And yeah, sometimes the Supreme Court of Canada does take it into account. So I don't know if you have any insight into what happened in 1980 to 1982 in terms of the thinking of the enactors.
Well, perhaps it's always a difficult question because the intent of the framers is a sort of collective concept that is not reducible to a particular person's state of mind. And courts, as you say, have been reluctant to put too much weight on that. And with respect to 1982, it's fun because in some cases you can actually phone these people and say, hey, what do you... Well, but this, unfortunately, is not the sort of thing that you can put before a court. Now, what we know on a more formal basis is what Harry Daniels said in, I think, the foreword to a book, which is that it was at the insistence of his organization in 1981 that 35 sub 2 was included in the end of the constitutional package, and he would say then that his organization represented people all across Canada. Now, another element is that at that time there was also an understanding that there were perhaps 2 labels that were used, Métis and quote-unquote non-status Indian. And then there are several deductions that you might make from this. Either in 35-2 they decided to protect the Métis but not the non-status Indians. Or you might say that, well, by using Indian, they included the non-status category because they wanted an inclusive definition. So it is difficult to reach, very definitive conclusions on the basis of what lawyers call original intent. And that's why I was suggesting perhaps a purposive interpretation, which has a historical element as well, but on a more abstract basis. What can you figure out as being the purpose? Not the intention of one particular person, but when you put the text in its historical context, when you look at the other parts of the Constitution, what appears to be the logical purpose of it? And then I say, well, perhaps it was to remedy a number of forms of exclusion, among which, of course, it was the exclusion of Métis Nation. I don't know if you...
Great. Any other questions? Yes, this microphone here. Please go ahead.
Okay, so my question is for Chris Andersen. Right at the end of your your speech or your presentation, you said something about ethno-fraud. And if you could just explain that a little bit more, and also how that ties to Manitoba specifically, because that's where I come from, with like the emergence of a lot of people who usually identified with French Canadian and now identify as being Métis, when they can like trace their roots back to, you know, the original Red River community and stuff like that. And if there's a relationship between what you meant by ethno-fraud and that kind of situation.
The term I had used was ethnic fraud.
Oh, ethnic fraud, sorry.
Which is not to critique what you said, but one of the things that I'm working on now is kind of a follow-up to the last book, are thinking about why people would want to self-identify as some category of Indigenous when they're not. Now, immediately people are going to say, well, who are you to say that they're not? Well, I'm nobody, really. And given the barely double-digit sales of my book, that probably establishes that even further. But the thing that I think that we forget about is that every time we speak, every time we make meaning something, there's something that gets excluded. You can't make sense of social reality without having things that include and exclude. You can go all the way back to kind of the structural linguists to talk about this kind of stuff. So from my perspective, I'm interested in why. This is a kind of a much bigger question than you probably meant to ask, but some of the early stuff I've been looking on is, did the fur trade families, for example, in the upper Great Lakes or even the lower Great Lakes, even though they have Aboriginal ancestry, think about themselves as Indigenous? The relatives certainly saw them as relatives, but did they see them as Indigenous? And there's a line of kind of biological essentialism that sits at the heart of the arguments that we make about indigeneity in general, both pre-contact and post-contact, and Métis more specifically. So for me, I get really kind of antsy when people make claims to some form of indigeneity, in this particular context, Métis indigeneity, without having somebody that claims them back. Or if they do have somebody that claims them back, that entity that claims them back can't link themselves back to a pre-colonial context. I have no problem with people kind of ebbing and flowing in terms of how they identify as kids and later as adults, or getting their kids and grandkids to identify. I mean, that's the reality of living in a colonial place like Canada that has such an elementally powerful weight of culture to do and to attempt to erase those kinds of things. But I do think that there's a white possessiveness that sits at the basis of a lot of these kinds of individual claims, because this is based on a very modern notion of identity, right? That we can be who we want to be and that we are who we say we are. There's this kind of unencumbered liberalism that sits at the basis of this. And so for me, ethnic fraud is when it happens in situations, or is more likely in situations, where people make claims that aren't then echoed back at them. But that's fraught with a whole bunch of other kind of factors. But yeah, that's what I meant. And in Manitoba context, Saskatchewan, Alberta, this of course is happening all the time. If you look at the ethnic mobility literature in Canada, one of the highest rates of ethnic mobility is happening in Saskatchewan. So people who didn't formally claim to Métis now claiming that they're Métis. And in many cases, most cases, hell, maybe even all cases in Saskatchewan, although I know of at least a couple that aren't. So say most cases that are legitimate.
All right, Mr. Belcourt.
Harry Daniels, I wish he were here. I bet a lot of people do. Harry and I knocked the ground together back in the 70s, in the 60s in Alberta, when we were both involved in the Metis Association of Alberta. And then later when we created the Native Council of Canada in 1971. And back in those days, I remember in Alberta, Jenny Marquettes and others had come to us, Indian Rights for Indian Women. They didn't have a voice, they didn't have a place. So in the Metis Association of Alberta, we allowed non-status Indian women to become members of the association. And the same thing happened in Saskatchewan. Métis and non-status Indians were together. And this carried on into the Native Council of Canada when we created it in 71. It was for Métis and non-status Indians. And what we wanted to do was to fight for the recognition of our rights. Both of us. We didn't actually articulate things the way they are being said today. But what it meant was people were coming together saying, we want to fight for our rights. And I know when Harry went and he fought, and he told Jean Chrétien, well, the heck with you then. I'm you know, the Métis, I'm not there. We'll be fighting you all across Canada if you don't put us in there. I know why he wanted us in there, because he knew we'd get dropped out of constitutional debate. It was no such thing as saying, well, as Aboriginal people, you're included. I think Harry felt safe that the word Indian would somehow include non-status Indians. But he meant to fight for, as we all did, the rights of the Métis, undefined in the way we're trying to do it now. Undefined in the sense that there's no question about the Métis whose origins are the buffalo hunting culture of the prairies. But what isn't known are these other unwritten chapters of history that we're now slowly starting to find out about, that I personally found out about in 2004 when I received the Michif song to bring to a nation-to-nation ceremony. And I learned about all of this because Nicholas Ruman connected me with the elder, Francis Eaglehart Cree, to tell us about how the Michif and the Chippewas had actually moved from the Sault Ste. Marie area in the 1700s, 1800s, when the beaver were being trapped out, and had moved west, and had actually been the families that were the foundation of the Turtle Mountain Reservation. And a painted hand ceremony that we held this year. We heard, because we had about a dozen pipes there, we heard from people who were there telling us about how the Métis had fought in the War of 1812 in Sault Ste. Marie. Others who were there who were saying, we had Métis people in our communities. We know we had Métis people in our communities. And they were talking about people around the local area there, Spanish River, for example. Now, I mention that because when we created the Native Council of Canada in 1971, we also created the Ontario Métis and Non-Status Indian Association. There was already a Northwest Ontario Métis Association, headed by Patty McGuire. And Métis non-status Indians came together in that province. We soon had people coming. They were identifying as non-status Indians very clearly, and other people were coming there and saying they were Métis from Métis communities in the province. In 1993, this was more than a decade after the Constitution Act 1982. The Ontario Métis and Non-Status Indian Association was a very uncomfortable place to be. Because we'd go to an assembly, we'd have 500, 600 people there, and there'd be half of them on this side of the aisle and half of them on this side of the aisle. People on this side of the aisle wanted to talk about getting their status back, everything related to being First Nations. The other side of the aisle, Métis people saying, that's not our discussion. So we decided to create two commissions, one to look into how we would implement our inherent right of self-determination as Métis, and how the First Nations people could go ahead and do that too. We went ahead and did our work. In fact, it was Jean Taillé, a law student at the time, who we got to do a paper for us on that subject. In 1993, we decided to split. The Métis decided it's time to get away. We couldn't, under an umbrella organization that was there to fight for the rights of very distinct groups, could continue. We couldn't continue to achieve our aspirations in this umbrella group. So it was a very difficult thing. Anybody who's gone through a divorce knows what that's like. Very hurtful, lots of people divided. We had the membership list of OMSIA. We sent a letter to everybody that was on that list that is identified as Métis. We said, we're creating the Métis Nation of Ontario. Come forward. Overnight, we had close to 1,000 people. Where did those people come from? They came from Communities like it's Spanish, North Bay, Mattawa, Timmins, Sault Ste. Marie, of course. What's happened since then is that a lot of those people who became citizens in the Métis Nation of Ontario have since themselves decided, we identify as First Nations, we're going to those. And those communities where the Métis communities have been absorbed, really. But there are a lot that were not absorbed because they always did identify as Métis, and they still do. So there are unwritten chapters here of the Métis people in this country. And what Harry wanted was that, okay, we're going to have an opportunity for those people who identify as Métis, make sure that they're in the Constitution. That if they need to, they're going to be able to fight on the basis of a constitutional right. With all due respect to all of the people within my nation, because I come from Alberta, you know, the Métis Nation is defined as those who are descendant of Red River, as well, without question. A Métis Nation, the Métis Nation, quite honestly, I don't know. I've been wrestling with this whole business politically now for more than 50 years. I think we need more than just cut and dried positions on who is Métis, who's legitimately Métis, who legitimately are the Métis in the Constitution of Canada. I think we need to have more openness and discussion about this. And I know we need to have it within the Métis Nation. We're not having it, or we haven't until now, but we need to have more of it. If in the end we say the Métis Nation is merely only those people, then fine. Or are we a Métis Federation? We're now asking ourselves, how can the Métis National Council say it is the government of the Métis Nation? What Métis Nation? You know, there's a lot of stuff going on here. Anyway, I appreciate all of what we've heard here. But when you ask a question about, as you did, who were the Métis that were intended when the word Métis was put in the Constitution, I don't know. All I know is that Harry fought like hell so that the Métis, whoever they are, we're going to have their rights protected.
Great, thank you very much. I think we have time for, I see two questioners, so two quick questions, is that?
So we've just heard some interesting contrasts of Métis First Nations relationships. And I was thinking during the presentation about Rob Innes's earlier presentation, as well as at least one context in Cape Breton I know of where the Unama'ki Voyageur Métis Nation, which is a self-identified Métis group, attempted to hunt and were physically prevented from hunting by Mi'kmaq warriors representing their community. So my question, which I think is a complex one, and I don't think there's a clear answer, but how much should positive relationships with First Nations, which I think is quite clear on the prairies, but obviously much more strained, we heard in BC and in the Maritimes in Quebec, how much should that count, if at all, in terms of Métis claiming to be in a place, to be from a place, to be Indigenous to a place? And can the same claims on the prairies, much like Rob was describing, also be made about other parts of Canada and the U.S.?
Go ahead if you want.
Perhaps I can have the first shot. So I think certainly what you could call generically inter-Indigenous recognition can be a positive factor to show that you you're actually an indigenous group. However, I'm a little bit more reluctant to see the absence of interindigenous recognition as a negative factor, because there seems to be resistance from recognized indigenous groups towards the recognition of new groups or additional groups. And there are reasons for that, I suppose. Limited resources provided for by the federal government, the idea that you would share the pie among more people. An example was given, I think, earlier today about C31, the idea that these new members would not come with additional funding and therefore deepen the housing crisis. So there may be practical reasons for that. There may be other reasons, but there is, I would say, documented history of opposition from established groups towards the claims of newer groups. And I wrote a paper on recognition of indigenous groups in Newfoundland and Labrador, and you can observe that, the idea that groups would dissociate based on perceptions of who's more likely to get recognition, and who appears to be more indigenous in the eyes of the mainstream society. So I think it's risky to make interindigenous recognition a negative factor.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's important. I'd say it is fraught in the way that Sebastien has talked about it, but not having it at all, not seeking it, not having any discussion of even a comment where, hey, well, they're not remembering their kinship relations or something like that is also an issue, because listen. I wish it weren't the case, but it is the case in colonial societies that people make illegitimate claims. They do. And we can disagree on what makes them illegitimate. We can have a discussion about that, but it happens. And there's a bunch of people that write about this in the States. There are philosophical issues why people do it, but it's worth having a conversation about. And having written the book over the past in the last year and a half, I've been called racist and exclusionary more times than I ever have in my entire life for simply saying that not everyone who calls himself Métis is Métis, and not everyone who calls himself Métis should be calling themselves Métis. By their own admission, as Denis has talked about in various contexts. It's a truthful stop. So if that's the case, then what are the dynamics through which we understand those kinds of recognition processes, and what makes some recognition processes legitimate and other ones not? Great, let's have that conversation. That's a whole hell of a lot more sophisticated a conversation to have. Is, well, they say they're Métis, so who are you to say that they're not? I'm not saying they're not. I want to know who their family is. Well, you're identity policing. Oh, okay, well, then you got me.
All right, one last question. Ms. Sloan?
Thank you. Je vous remercie pour toutes les présentations. And I just have a little joke from my uncle, who used to say that whenever there's two Métis, there's three opinions. Or at least three opinions. I just have a question which is maybe mostly directed to Chris, but anyone, please feel free to respond. I was thinking about the idea of community, and I also feel annoyed that courts and the government always refer to Métis communities and not to Métis nations, or I guess I do say peoples. So in that discussion of peoplehood and nationhood, where might community fit in there? Is there a possibility that it might? Or is community sort of a subset of nation or people? Or do you see any place for the Cherokee scholars' version of nation as community?
Sorry, can you just say what you mean by community? Because you're differentiating it from people. So what do you mean when you use it? Do you mean like a settlement?
Yeah, that's a really good question. But I'm thinking about it as more of a smaller group as opposed to an overarching group. But it has some sort of... You mentioned the idea of... some sort of alliances. I can't remember the phrase you used, horizontal. Help me out.
Oh.
Comradeship.
That's sounded perverted there for a second, but horizontal comradeship, which is the argument that Benedict Andersen uses.
Say that again. Sorry.
Horizontal comradeship. I never even thought about it in that context, actually, which says more about me than you.
Comradeship.
Yeah, or sexual. So his point basically is, why is it that people who live in such kind of material inequality still see themselves as kind of the same as everyone else? That's kind of the leveling ideological effect of nationalism.
What do you mean when you say community then? It's because if you're objecting to the use.
I try not to use community, actually.
Mm-hmm.
I try not to use the term identity either for similar kinds of reasons. I just think the term gets packed with so much freight that it ends up meaning whatever the person wants it to mean. And so people who think they're talking about the same thing by using the same term are in fact talking about things that are quite different. So not to get too deep into it, but I don't think there is such a thing as the Métis peoples. I think there's the Métis people. Now, they might have certain historical settlements that they went into and left out of as part of their historical mobility that they moved into in the 20th century more permanently. There may be new urban centers that they moved into, but I try not to use community precisely because it becomes such a loaded term to try and figure out. So it's like this Rubik's Cube that you have to get through before you can have a conversation with them.
Okay, thanks.
All right. Well, I know that I gained so much by hearing from our panelists today, and so please join me again in a round of applause for our three speakers. Good job. Very well done.
Where's our gifts? The speakers have gifts too. I just forgot them in my office over lunch. I'll make sure I bring them down for lunch. For you guys after the break. We have about 15 minutes before the next panel, which is actually more specifically addressed to the topic of Métis as treaty parties. So there's coffee and I think some snacks upstairs on the third floor. Please help yourself, and then we'll rejoin down here at 3 o'clock.